A walk cycle is one of the most basic and most difficult things in animation. Basic because it has fairly simple rules that anyone can quickly learn and apply. The difficult thing is to make a good walk cycle, since not only by applying the rules means that we are applying them in the correct proportions, and because our eyes are used to see people walk all the time, if the walk cycle is not very well done, the audience will instantly see that something is wrong, even though they might not know what it is. Just by watching someone walk, you can already get a lot of information from that person. How they feel, their personality, if they are tired, if they are afraid, if they are shy or extroverts, if they think a lot, etc, etc. That's why knowing how to animate walk cycles is so important. Not only because in a walk cycle you must involve all the parts of the body in perfect harmony, but also because with it you can show to the audience everything you want them to know about your character. In this course you will learn how to do a proper generic walk cycle. It is essential that you first learn how to properly animate a generic walk cycle, as this will be a very strong foundation so that later you can easily do any type of walk cycle. Being able to focus on adding personality to your character and not struggling trying to get him to move in a credible and realistic way. A generic walk cycle lasts 1 second, i.e. 24 frames. 12 frames with one foot and 12 with the other one. The cycle will have 4 poses that will define each step. The contact pose, the extreme low pose, the intermediate pose, and the extreme high pose. And although generally you will want to have some kind of reference for all your animations, because I'm going to animate a generic walk cycle, I will not use any reference this time. Hi, in this class I will show you how to set up your workspace to start animating the walk cycle. For this exercise I will set up the arms on FK. And I'll set up the head, neck and arm rotations to be independent from the body. I'll make sure the rotations are in gimbal mode. I will use this viewport to animate the front view instead of having the main camera. So I'll activate the visibility of the tools, and I'll frame the character to see it bigger. Since I'll be using the picker, I will hide all controls, and on the second viewport I will have the side view. I'll set the range of the timeline until frame 24, since the pose of frame 25 will be the same as the one on frame 1. And I'll configure the preferences so that the new keyframes are created on constant mode. Okay, now we just have to start animating. Hi, in this class I'm going to show you everything you need to know to create this generic walk cycle. The hips will move forwards with a symmetrical spacing. In other words, every frame has to move forwards equally as much. The highest point for the hips will happen on the extreme high poses, and its lowest point will be at the extreme low poses. The hips will move fluently from side to side, changing direction with a small slow in and a slow out. And the direction change will happen 1 frame before the extreme high poses. The torso will rotate in opposition to the hips. and it will change the direction on the rotation y-axis 3 frames before the hips do. It will have a slight sway from side to side, but not a lot, since we'll reduce this sway by moving the torso in the opposite direction to where the rotations on the y-axis moves it. And it will also rotate slightly forwards, reaching its maximum point on the intermediate poses. And right after, it will begin to straighten up backwards until it regains its original position on the contact poses. The arm will move forwards, rotating outwards and away from the body. And will move backwards, rotating inwards and getting closer to the body. The top parts of the arm will change direction right after each contact pose. And the bottom parts and the wrist will replicate this movement with a slight overlap. Keep in mind that the arms will never be fully stretched and will always have a slight bend. The shoulders will rotate back and forth along with the arms. The head will try to keep itself straight, but it will still have a slight wobble laterally and frontally as a consequence of the body movements. Because despite the fact that the head will rotate to stay as straight as possible, the slightly abrupt movements and the impacts received in the body should be reflected in the head, even if it is just a little bit, since it has a big joint called neck. Unlike any other joint, it will bend when the part of the body to which it is attached quickly changes direction, creating then a whip-like overlap. The more relaxed the character is, the more relaxed the neck will be, and therefore a greater whip-like overlap will see on the head. For example, the head nods slightly overlap with the vertical movements of the body, starting to rotate down just after the contact pose, as here the body starts to slow down drastically its vertical movement down. And begins to rotate up just after the intermediate pose, since here the body starts to slow down drastically its vertical movement up. However, since the side-to-side movements of the body are not too big or abrupt, the head will have a great capacity to stay balanced on that axis. Since we'll set up the head so that it stays straight by default, in this exercise the only thing that I will do in this axis is to create a small overlap by rotating it to the side of the supporting leg, making the extreme point of this rotation approximately in the intermediate pose, since here the body will have drastically slowed down its side-to-side movement. The feet will move forwards arching slightly outwards, not on a straight line. Since we want to move using the least amount of energy possible, when we move the feet forwards we won't lift them unnecessarily, just enough to lift them off the ground so that we can move without stumbling. The knees should always be moving forwards and cannot move backwards nor freeze in the same point. And the last thing is that the character should be slightly unbalanced forwards on the intermediate poses, since this imbalance is what makes our bodies move and keep moving forwards. That's it, now you know everything you need to know about the walk cycle, so see you next class! Hi, in this class I will show you how to create the contact poses for your walk cycle. We will start by creating the first pose on frame 1. This pose is called the contact pose because it's the pose in which the front foot contacts with the ground. We'll rotate the hips according to the leg that we're going to put forwards. And because all the weights will still be on the back leg and the front leg isn't raised, the hips will be rotated over the back leg. Okay, so in this pose we want the back leg to be slightly bent, with the foot pointing slightly outwards, and with the heel raised. The front leg will be straight, with the foot pointing outwards as well, with only the heel touching the ground. Also tilt the front foot slightly to the side using the special rotations so that the pose is more natural and the foot is not too parallel with the ground. Depending on the character and how big we want the stride to be, we'll have to lower the body accordingly. And for this generic walk cycle, we'll make the stride neither too big nor too small. Now in the front view, we'll bring both feet more to the middle. And although the body will be quite centered in this pose, it will still be slightly over the back leg. So very slightly we'll move the central control over it. Now we'll pose the torso, rotating it in the opposite direction of the hips. And we will adjust its position to counteract the side movement created by the rotation on the y-axis, and thus keeping it quite stable and reducing the excessive motion from side to side. Because he's moving forwards on a flat surface, we'll bend him slightly forwards. Next, we'll rotate the arms so that the one in the front has the top part rotated beyond verticality. And the lower part is rotated a little beyond parallelism with the front leg. We'll make sure that in the front view there is a small negative space between the arm and the body, and we'll rotate it slightly inwards on the y-axis. We'll rotate the shoulders very little so that they are rotated relative to the arm position. And finally, we'll rotate the wrist very slightly outwards on the Z-axis, very slightly forwards, and a bit outwards on the Y-axis. And finally, we'll pose the fingers to make them relaxed. Okay, next we rotate backwards the other arm. We'll give it a slight bend. We'll leave a negative space between the arm and the body on the side view. We'll rotate the shoulder accordingly. Rotate the arm slightly outwards on the Y-axis. And with the Z-axis, adjust it so it's just slightly behind the body. Pose the hand rotating it back on the X-axis, a little inwards on the Z-axis, and a little inwards on the Y-axis. And finally, we'll pose the fingers to make them relaxed. Now we just need to pose the head, and because in this pose the body is moving down, we'll rotate it upwards very slightly. For this walk cycle, as the head isn't going to move much, and we have the head and neck configured so that they automatically compensate the torso's rotation, in other words that they will stay in balance unless we rotate them, we won't need to animate the neck, but for the record this is an exception. Okay, so now we'll go 12 frames forwards to frame 13 and we'll create the contact pose of the opposite foot. To do this second contact pose, you could copy and paste the values from this pose by deactivating these two options of the graph editor, then select the controls you want to copy, selecting all the keyframes of frame 1 on the graph editor, and pasting the values on frame 13 using paste flipped. Although it's much better to create the poses manually, since a slight variation on the poses will give a much natural feeling to your animation. Now we'll just have to reposition the character so that he moves forwards, and with the feet and central control selected, we'll go to the graph editor, select the location Y curves of the three, since these are the ones that represent their forward movements, and adjust them so that the planted foot remains on the same place. This means that while it's touching the ground, its line must be completely flat. But make sure that when you move the curves, you have the normalize option deactivated, otherwise the different controls will not move proportionally. And zoom quite a bit to make sure that the line of the planted foot is completely flat. As you can see, the front foot will maintain its position, but will go from being the front foot to the back foot. And finally, we'll create the contact pose copying the first one to frame 25. Making sure that the knee orientators are always ahead of them and don't stay behind. Okay, contact poses done. See you next class. Hi, in this lecture we'll create the intermediate poses. On frame 7 we'll create the intermediate pose, in which the character will rise up and will be supported entirely by one leg. So we'll move the central control over the supporting leg, which will be bent ever so slightly and have the foot flat on the ground. We'll set the hips to 0 on the rotation Z-axis, and as the weight is in this leg, we'll rotate them down on the Y-axis from the supporting leg. But make sure that they are less rotated on the Y-axis than in the next contact pose. The leg on the air will have the foot pointing down. There will be a negative space between this foot and the other leg in the front view, and will be rotated outwards a little bit. In the side view there will also be a negative space between the knee and the other leg, and between both feet. But remember that you must set all special rotations to 0 and post the feet with the general rotations. Finally, I'll orient the knee inwards a little bit, and then rotate the torso in opposition to the hips on the Y-axis, and to keep the torso centered, we'll move it to the opposite side. Like the hips, we'll set the Z-axis to 0, and rotate it a little bit further on the X-axis. Now we'll set the shoulders to 0 since the arms will be on the sides of the body. The arm on the side of the supporting leg will keep the same amount of bend. Rotate it outwards on the Z-axis until there is a small space between the hand and the body, and set the rotation Y-axis to 0. Reduce the hand rotation on the X-axis, and rotate it inwards on the Y and Z axis. This arm will be straighter, but it will be slightly more flexed than the other one. We'll rotate the top part on the X-axis until it's pointing back ever so slightly, and rotate the bottom part so it's a little ahead than the other arm. In the front view it should be away from the silhouette of the body, but very close to it. And we'll rotate it slightly outwards on the Y-axis. Finally, we'll reduce to 0 the hand rotation of the X-axis, and rotate it ever so slightly outwards on the Z-axis and inwards on the Y-axis. To finish the pose, rotate the head down a little bit, and rotate it to the side to settle its inertia, since the body will have almost completely stopped the side-to-side movement, and therefore the head will rotate slightly like a whip. We could also animate the side-to-side rotations of the head so it leads the movement, which would give the character a greater sense of determination and certainty of where he's going. But since we're animating a generic work cycle, therefore more relaxed, we'll animate the head in such a way that the overlap is like a whip. Now just create the same pose inverted on frame 19 and done. Intermediate poses done, so see you next class. Hi, in this class I will show you how to create the extreme up and extreme down poses. Okay, so we'll proceed to create the breakdowns between each one of these poses. They will be on frame 4, 10, 16 and 22. On frames 4 and 16 we'll have the poses where he will have just taken the step. Therefore the front foot will be completely flat on the ground and the body will be at its lowest point. This time to pose the hips and the torso we'll use the breakdowner, since we want the rotations to be right in between the other two poses. To pose the central control, since we want the hips to move with a constant spacing forwards, first we'll use the breakdowner keying the pose to be just in the middle of the movement. And since it is the extreme down pose, we'll have to lower the body accordingly. We want to bring down the body until the lower part of the leg is tilted back ever so slightly, because we want to have enough room so that in the following poses the knee can keep moving forwards on every frame, thus maintaining a fluid movement. Next, we'll set the special rotations to 0 on the rear foot, and making sure that the toe stays on the same place on the side view, we'll pose it with the foot general rotations, leaving it approximately at a 45-degree angle. We'll also rotate it outwards on the Y and Z axis, and since these rotations will change the position of the toe on the front view, we'll move it slightly on the location X-axis so that it stays at the same point than in the contact pose. And of course make sure that the toe is not going through the ground. We'll use the breakdowner to pose the knee orientators to keep their curves clean, and we'll use the breakdowner to pose all the arms and shoulders controls, but instead of leaving them in between poses, we'll favor the previous pose to create a slow out in the movement. Also, we'll rotate slightly backwards the lower part of the arm on the X-axis, because as the arm starts to move forwards, we'll drag behind the lower part a little bit. Okay, so now we only have to pose the head, in which we'll also use the breakdowner to create an intermediate pose. And to finish, we'll create the same pose but inverted on frame 16. Okay, so now we'll create the last pose of the blocking, in which the character reaches its highest point. So we'll create a keyframe on frame 10, use the breakdowner in the central control to make sure that the body keeps the same speed forwards, and adjust its height so that the planted leg is fully straight. But of course make sure that it doesn't deform stretching, leave it at the point where the leg just gets straight. And then we'll go to the graph editor and favor the extreme keyframe of the location x-axis, so that the character stays longer over the supporting leg. To pose the hips, we'll use the breakdowner and favor the next pose, since the upper part of the leg will almost have reached its extreme point on the forward rotation, and therefore the hips will have to correspond this rotation. We'll place the lifted foot in front of the planted foot on the side view and leave it pointing slightly downwards. Rotate it inwards on the Y and Z axis. Move it out a little so that it moves forwards, creating a small visual arc outwards. And we'll keep it almost touching the ground. And remember to make sure that the knee orientators are always ahead of the knees and don't stay behind. To pose the torso, we'll use the breakdowner, creating an intermediate pose. And in the Y-axis, we'll go to the graph editor and make the rotation on frame 10 greater than in the next contact pose. This way it will begin to rotate in the opposite direction on frame 11, giving a little more strength and awareness to the character, since the torso will be anticipating the change of fulcrum before it happens. And finally, to pose the shoulders and wrists, we'll use the breakdowner slightly favoring the next pose to create a slow in until the contact pose. Now we just need to replicate this pose inverted on frame 22, and we have finished the first walking pass of our walk cycle. Hi, in this lecture I'm gonna teach you how to refine your blocking. Now is the perfect time to watch our walk cycle, improve it, correct mistakes, and show it to our colleagues to get feedback. So the first thing that I realized that I have to fix are the feet in the poses 4 and 16, as they are rotating inwards too much, therefore creating a pop on the heel. So I'll reposition them, making sure that the toes stay on the same point on the front and side view. Another thing that I will modify are the X rotations on the front foot in the contact poses, since now watching it again I feel that they are a bit excessive. Then I'll adjust the knee orientators so that in the front view the knees move smoothly from side to side. Another very important thing that I need to fix is the vertical movement of the central control, since now it seems that the body rises up too fast and stops this movement very abruptly. So let's analyze the graph editor, and we can clearly see we made a mistake here, because the intermediate pose is higher than the extreme up pose. So I'll modify the graph editor so that there is a small slow in to the extreme high pose on the location Z axis. As you can see now, the big movement will still be from the extreme low to the intermediate pose, but now there will also be 3 frames of slow in to the extreme pose. Next, I will also fix the rotations of the wrist forwards and backwards on the x-axis, since now they stop the movement quite abruptly at the end of the forward movement of the arm. And as we can see in the graph editor, the issue is something similar to what happened in the location z-axis on the central control, so I will adjust the keyframes to create a slow in on the rotation x-axis of the wrists. As you can see from the blocking, we can perceive the fluidity of the movements and have a very good idea of how our final animation will look like. Hi, in this class we'll proceed to switch all the tangents to Bezier. To do this, deactivate these two boxes on the graph editor to ensure that we're seeing all the curves of all the controls on all axes, change all the curves to Bezier, and then reactivate the options again. Next, we'll go to the preferences and configure them so that all the new keyframes are created with Bezier tangents. Okay, so now as you can see, everything seems to move smoothly, apart from the legs, which are full of pops on the knees. But before polishing the legs, we have to make sure that the movements of the central control, the hips and the feet move correctly, since any later modifications of any of these will affect the position of the knees. The first thing we'll do is to adjust the body sway so that the central control shifts direction on frame 9, therefore making the leg lead the movement by one frame. Clean up the curves, removing all the keyframes in between, leaving only the extremes. And since I'm creating a cycle, I'll make sure that the end of the curve flows correctly with the beginning of it. Next, to make sure that the character moves forwards with a symmetric spacing, delete all the frames except for the first one and last one, and change the handles to vector to get a completely straight line. We'll also clean up the curves of the torso rotations, deleting all the in-between keyframes that mess up the curves. We'll make the foot almost completely flat on the ground on the frame after the contact pose. In this case, I'll reduce the rotation x-axis to 0, but I will leave a small slow-in on the y-axis. Also, I'm going to create a little bit of drag on the tiptoes to create a bit more overlap, and on the next frame I'll pose the foot completely flat on the ground. We'll make sure that the feet move smoothly on the side and frontal view, that they don't go through the ground, and that when they lift off the ground they do it smoothly. We'll make sure that the toes stay at the same point as the foot comes off the ground, going frame by frame adjusting it, and of course make sure that the toes don't slide on the ground. And also making sure that the spacing of the foot lifting up is progressive. In other words, if you track the ankle, it has to have a slow out coming off the ground. Keep in mind that generally you don't want to pose the foot completely vertical, since it could give the impression that the ankle joint is broken. And once this is done, we'll proceed to get rid of the pops. There are two key points that we have to observe carefully to eliminate the knee pops: when the leg goes from straight to bent, and when it straightens up, since you must create a slow out and a slow in respectively. Make sure that the knees don't move backwards on any frame, and make sure that when the supporting leg goes through the intermediate pose, the knees don't freeze for a couple of frames on the same point. They must move with a coherent spacing with progressive slow ins and slow outs. Use the arrows on the keyboard to move frame by frame, so you can easily analyze the spacing on each frame. If possible, we'll try to make small adjustments to the special and general rotations of the foot to reduce the pops. Since some of the pops are due to bad positioning of the foot, I will adjust it accordingly so that both the ankle and the knee move in arcs throughout the animation. And if we need it, which is very likely, we'll use the knee polishing controls to refine them and make their movement perfectly smooth. We'll make sure that the knees move with a progressive spacing, reducing the spacing until the intermediate pose and increasing the spacing after it, because now there are several frames where the knee is completely frozen and we don't want that. Thinking again, instead of bringing the knee inwards when they move forwards, I'll move them outwards to check if it feels more natural. And indeed, for this walk cycle looks better like this. Now it would be the perfect time to show it to your classmates so that they can give you feedback before you do the last polishing pass. So see you next class. Hi, in this class I'm going to show you how to polish your walk cycle. For this animation, one of the things that I want to correct and polish are the shoulders, since I feel they move a bit too much. So I reduce the rotations on the graph editor. Also, I will slightly increase the torso rotations on the y-axis so that the character bends a little bit more, because now I feel that it's a bit too stiff. I will slightly increase the lateral movements of the central control, although normally we don't want to do this after polishing the knee pops, but since the adjustment is very small, we won't need to repolish the knees. Next, I will adjust the arms. Firstly, I'll create a slower slow in and a slow out on the forearm, cause now changes direction very abruptly. Then I'll clean up the y-axis curves of the arms and wrists to make them more fluid. The idea is that the arms should appear relaxed, but should move as if the character controlled them, not like there were two pieces of wood hanging down. Here I'm creating a slow in on the z-axis of the arm when it has just rotated backwards, so that it doesn't stop the movement as if it had hit a wall. Next I'll clean up the head rotations and exaggerate them a little bit more. And finally, to make it more organic, we'll add the hips rotations of the x-axis, giving a little more elasticity to the spine. Because even if it is very subtle, it will improve it. Note that we will not use the hip control, as it would spoil the animation that we have already polished on the legs and knees. So instead we'll use the polishing controls. Every time the character takes one step, the impact will rotate the hips a bit backwards, slightly reducing the arc of the lower back. So on frame 4 we're going to move slightly back the lower control, and even more slightly the middle one. In the graph editor we'll remove all intermediate keyframes and set back the control to its original position on the contact poses. Done. So next, to give even more flexibility to the torso of the character, we'll create a bit of a squash and stretch on his torso. Keep in mind that although it might seem that the squash should occur on the extreme down poses, since all the different parts of the body move with overlap, the torso will start to slow down its vertical movement a couple of frames after the character's hips do. And since it starts moving up right after, and the torso is still settling its movement downwards, these two inertias in opposite directions will cause the torso to continue squashing until the intermediate pose. From where it will begin to stretch again until it regains its original shape on the contact poses. Okay, so now is another perfect time to show our animation to our colleagues so that they can give us feedback. For example, they could tell us that the hips rotate too much on the z-axis and that they would reduce that rotation. They could also tell us that in the front view the feet move too far away from the body, so that they would reduce the side-to-side movements of the feet. Furthermore, they could tell us that they feel that the arms rotate very little forwards and too much backwards on the x-axis. And they could also tell us that when the arms rotate forwards, they get too far away from the body on the front view. And since we have modified the hips and the feet, now we have to repolish the knees again. That's why it's a very good idea to ask for feedback to your colleagues throughout the process, but especially before starting to polish your animations to avoid having to redo the work that you had already done. Be smart and take advantage of the Facebook group, and do not hesitate to ask your classmates for feedback, since they will see your animations with fresh eyes, so they will see much more easily errors, pops, and possible improvements. But keep in mind that each person could say different things, so you should be the one to make the final decision of what changes and adjustments to apply. So that's it, work cycle finished. Hi, so we have finished our generic work cycle, and in this class I will show you how to prolong it and modify it. If now you wanted to extend the walk cycle so that the character kept walking forwards, deactivate again these two options on the graph editor to make sure that all the keyframes are shown, select all the controls and then select all the keyframes on the graph editor, except the first keyframe because it's the same pose as the one on frame 25 and we don't want to duplicate it. And we'll copy and paste them at frame 26. Now to continue animating, we'll reactivate these two boxes and we'll expand the timeline range to view up to frame 48. But now, as you can see, instead of moving forwards, it goes back to the beginning. To solve this, we'll just have to select the central control, the feet and the orientation controls of the knees, and in the graph editor we'll select the location y-axis curves, since these are the ones that will determine the forward movement. We'll lower the keyframes from frame 25 to match and follow the path of previous curves. And to make sure that we're positioning the keyframes correctly, make sure that while the foot of the supporting leg is touching the ground, its curve is completely flat. Now you only have to practice and experiment with different cycles until you can do it from memory, since to be a good animator it is essential that you're fast and effective when you have to put your character to work. Moving the curves of the graph editor, you can quickly modify the work cycle and transform it easily. For example, if I wanted to turn the character into a giant, who therefore weighs a lot, the first thing I will do is to slow it down quite a bit, scaling all the graph editor curves. In this case, I will extend it 12 frames until frame 37, to make sure that for all the poses I'm adding the same number of frames in between, 2 in this case. Therefore now the work cycle will be 50% slower. I will also slightly increase the movement from side to side of the central control, since going slower means he has to transfer more of his weight over the supporting leg, so that he has time to move the other leg forwards without falling down. I will also slightly increase the torso rotations on the y-axis to convey that he needs to use more force to keep the balance. And for the same reasons, I will slightly increase the movements of the arms on the z and x-axis. And to really give the character a heavier feeling, I will modify the spacing of the central control on the vertical movements, so that instead of moving very smoothly up and down, he slowly rises and comes down faster in the fall. To do this, in the contact pose keyframe, I will select the location z-axis of the central control, change the handles to free and verticalize them. Also, I will slightly enlarge the top and down handles to favor the low poses, because as he weighs a lot, it would be harder for him to slow down his movement, so it will take more frames to settle down and being able to start moving up again. So basically this way will transmit a greater weight, since it will rise slowly and fairly even. When it's reaching the extreme high pose, it will start to slow down, reducing the spacing. Then gravity will start to take effect, so it will change direction downwards, and because he collides against the ground in a more accelerated way, it will give the feeling of a greater weight. Finally, I will adjust the feet so that they are completely flat on the floor 2 frames after the contact pose. And as before, we have to repolish the pops that have appeared on the knees. Done, congratulations, this is the end of the course. Hope you liked it. Now you just need to practice, practice and practice, and post your animation on the group to get feedback. Hope to see you around again. Bye!